It was muted, so I mean. Okay, I think now it's working. Sorry? I can answer all the questions.
Okay, Sami, where are you? We were waiting for you.
Oh, Chris is off.
You wanna sit still, or you wanna sit first and then join?
Both are fine. It's a little bit weird, though. I mean, you're at the start of the evening. I'll just come up for my short introduction.
As you wish.
Should I recenter myself?
Yeah, because I think it's not really the role of a discussant in conference.
It's really whatever works.
Chris, are you the last? Or do you know?
I don't see anyone coming after me. Sami's here. Yeah.
Okay.
This is right.
Okay. So we will start right on time, more or less, which is a good sign. Welcome everybody. I see many faces, I recognize also. Thanks to the many students also to come in this class-free week, 2 days before the holidays, or 2 days before the holidays. That's nice to see you here. Also nice to see a lot of colleagues. Welcome to our lecture and the book presentation of Muriam Haleh Davis. Let me introduce our guest speaker. So Muriam Haleh Davis obtained a PhD as a historian. She obtained a PhD at New York University. And she's now a professor in the Department of History at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Her research focused until now on colonial history, development, decolonization, and race in North Africa, more specifically in Algeria. She's currently working on the history of the social sciences and decolonization with a particular focus on the discipline of sociology. I got from the website. Muriam, she also co-edited an edited volume on North Africa and the Making of Europe, Governance, Institution and Culture, which was published with Bloomsbury in 2018, if I remember correctly. But she's here more specifically to talk about her first monograph book published this year in 2022 with the title Markers of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria, and it was published with Duke University. And just to be complete, she's also a co-editor on the Maghreb page in Jadalia, and also she's also on the editorial committee of the Middle East Research and Information Project in Maghreb. So without further ado, Muriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and for everyone's labor that has gone into bringing me here. I had lots of flight up and downs yesterday, so I'm glad that I made it. And also thank you for being here. Again, I know the holiday season is upon us and there are lots of things happening, so I appreciate everyone's time. I should also mention, just for legal reasons, that I'm technically withholding labor right now for my university for a strike, so I am here representing myself. Just in case any UC lawyers happen to be on this live stream, this is not labor. I also wanted to start, we were talking a little bit at lunch about disciplines and disciplinary knowledge, and since there are some people maybe grappling with these questions, I thought maybe I would just start by saying that this book comes out of my own unhappiness with many different disciplinary trajectories. I started my master's in area studies and Middle Eastern studies. I went on to start a PhD in critical theory, and then I ended up finishing my PhD in history. And so I think that made the book perhaps more interesting, but certainly less legible as well in terms of where I fit. And I'd be happy, for graduate students or others out there who want to talk about what does it mean to kind of adopt a discipline and inhabit it, sometimes in uncomfortable ways. I'm happy to chat about that. And I'll also pass the book around in case you're bored of me speaking. You can perhaps look at the photos. If you find a typo, do not tell me. I don't want to know. I'm not opening the book precisely for that reason. Hi, good to see you. Just right on time. I was just talking about interdisciplinary angst, so I know we've also spoken about that. Okay, so I'm going to start with the anecdote that opens the book, which I think in some ways encapsulates some of the questions that I'm trying to get at. On the 1st of April, 1947, the Swiss diplomat William Repard gave the opening lecture at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Conference. This is a conference, as you might know, that had been organized by Frederick Hayek and has been considered the first instance of a quote-unquote neoliberal thought collective. Repard himself had spent 18 years as the director of the Mandate section at the League of Nations. And of course, that's the body that was responsible for administering the colonies carved out of the Ottoman and German Empire after World War I. So here he is, Repard, giving this talk at kind of the preeminent conference that will come to be known as a neoliberal thought collective. He also has some colonial baggage he's carrying with him. And during the talk, he mused on the alleged universality of Adam Smith's writings that for him, quote, assumed that the average man, always and everywhere, sought to obtain the maximum amount of material satisfaction at a minimum cost of effort. This ideal of the rational wealth maximizing subject has, of course, subsequently been criticized and has been at the center of a number of debates around the figure of Homo economicus. So Homo economicus is one trope that structures the monograph. But Repard himself was troubled by the assumption that this model of humanity, this wealth maximizing model, was relevant everywhere. So he starts talking about his time in Algeria during the landing of the Allied forces in November of 1942. And he says that he had been, quote, impressed by the sight of the Arabs seated on the curb of the sidewalks because they, quote, seemed quite indifferent to what was going on and were absolutely idle, end of the quote. And so when he was expressing his puzzlement to a French friend in Algeria, the latter responded that, quote, the Arabs in Algiers never do any more work than was absolutely necessary, and explained that attempts by the French state to increase their rations during the war had actually decreased their productivity. So Rappard continues to wonder if this figure of Homo economicus was based on a Scottish template. After all, this is Adam Smith's background. Perhaps Homo economicus only made sense when one is talking about a Nordic mountaineer, and this was a very different kind of sociological being from the Algerian Arab. This goes in his thinking. He asked if Smith would have defended the universality of Homo economicus if this individual had been, quote, reared among the sun-baked race of Arabs who prefer leisure to work, security on the lowest scale to the insecurity of initiative, and therefore equality to liberty. So Rappard himself, while giving this talk, doesn't speak explicitly in terms of racial types. But I think it's pretty clear that lurking behind this language and this question of the Scottish versus Arab template is how different races were defined in relationship to labor and productivity. And so this gets at my book, which looks at how the French state embarked on development programs after World War II. And this is a time during which economists and politicians revisit these older debates on the relationship between race and the economy. That is to say, against the backdrop of the Cold War and, of course, decolonization, these economists, technocrats, politicians increasingly promoted market exchange as an essential weapon in defending Western civilization and combating these twin threats of totalitarianism on the one hand and decolonization on the other. And I think this discussion also gives us some idea of how colonial development was influencing mainstream liberal discussions on economic orthodoxy. Very rarely have people looked at the formation of neoliberal thought in colonial territories, for example. Often this is studied as something that white economists in Europe were kind of cooking up in Europe and then perhaps got exported to the colonies. So I'm also interested in what does it mean to take colonialism seriously as a chapter in the history of economic thought. So my dissertation, some of you might be wondering kind of how do you get from book to dissertation? And I'll try to speak to that a bit as well. The dissertation really began with a much more narrow story, which is that of the Constantine Plan. The Constantine Plan was a plan for development, both economic and social, introduced by Charles de Gaulle in 1958. And as many of you know, 1958 is during the Algerian Revolution, so it's not, it's not mysterious why the French state all of a sudden is trying to spend considerable resources to help the material conditions of Muslim Algerians, and I could put help in parentheses, in quotations mark there. So when I started this project, I thought it was really interesting that there was a major development initiative happening in Algeria at the same time as European economic reconstruction and European integration. And I wondered about the links between those two projects. I wondered, how did the colonial context and the fact that the majority of the population in Algeria were Muslim influence the way planners envisioned, but also implemented economic and social development? And I was also being trained in a moment, at least in the United States, when post-colonial studies were very much at the forefront of discussions. And often the focus there was on rhetoric, it was on narrative, it was about othering through language, but the kind of material dimensions fell out. And I wanted to know, what would it look like to think about political economy and capital accumulation, taking these tools into account? There seemed to be a kind of chasm between kind of Marxian political economy on the one hand and post-colonial rhetoric studies on the other, and I felt a little bit frustrated at the inability to bring them together. So this book is one attempt, probably imperfect, but in good faith, to try to do that. So at the same time that I was reading a lot of Marxist theory, I was also a good Foucaultian, as many people were in the early 2000s. And I was invested in economic discussions and discourse, not only as a way of thinking about how wealth got distributed or how capital was accumulated, but also as an indication of how one envisions the human. So that is to say, what do economic discourses tell us about the human as a subject, right? And this is a classically Foucaultian approach, and I plead guilty to have drunk a lot of that Kool-Aid at some point. In some ways, I'm still drinking the Kool-Aid. So I'll come clean on that one. So one quote that I found in the archive that really shaped how I thought about the project is the following. And this was written by one of the key writers of the Constantine Plan, a French technocrat, Jean Vibert. And he writes, "Thanks to the Constantine Plan, Homo economicus has been born. He has replaced Homo Islamicus, who accepted an extremely low level of material needs and who, as a result, did not feel the need to work more than necessary. He slowly becomes Homo economicus, who is still driven, who is as driven by his needs just as his European counterpart is, and who consequently starts working and is concerned with the betterment of his outputs or bonuses, or with improving his skill, and who has the underlying yet profound desire to uplift his children and the next generation." So alongside the first trope that I already introduced, that of Homo economicus, this figure of neoliberal thought, here we have crystallized a second trope, which students of Orientalism and Orientalist thought will recognize, that of Homo Islamicus. So Homo Islamicus, much like Homo economicus, is an ideal type, right? Neither of these figures have ever existed in the real world or in the archive that I have come across, luckily for me, perhaps, because I cannot imagine knowing Homo economicus would be an incredibly pleasurable experience. But nevertheless, they both epitomize figures of European modernity in one fantasy or another. And I initially wanted to entitle the book From Homo Islamicus to Homo Economicus. And I will say that my publishers at Duke very wisely told me this was one of the worst book titles that they had ever heard. Nobody would review the book, nobody would buy the book. And so it is now Markets of Civilization. So for me, this tension between Homo economicus, the exemplar of European economic modernity, and Homo Islamicus, this model of native social practices, provides a grammar that structures debates on colonial policy from the interwar period to the 1960s. So again, while the dissertation was really about the 1950s and this kind of late colonial moment, the book spans from the 19th century all the way through Ben Bella's presidency to 1965. So to grapple with how planners were making use of this accumulated colonial knowledge over the course of development, the first chapter argues for Islam as what I term a racial regime of religion. And I'm riffing off of Brenna Bundar's notion and writings on land. But I realized as I was workshopping the manuscript, and people would ask me, well, what is it? Is it race? Is it religion? And I found that there was not the space I was looking for analytically to understand how Islam became a racial category. And it was also important to me that it's not just that Islam was racialized, right? It's not just that Muslims were described as the other. As we know from studying race and racial formations, the question of race is always tied to political and economic power and also reflected in particular legal mechanisms. So I wasn't just interested with the discourse of economic language and the way it othered Muslims. I wanted to show how this influenced the actual construction of a colonial capitalist regime in Algeria. And so talking about Islam as a racial regime of religion, or that the way that religions can come to occupy the analytical, political, and economic space of racial formations is one of the things that I was trying to do here. So these shifting visions of capitalism at the same time, there wasn't one vision of what colonial capitalism should look like in Algeria. The French politicians and technocrats and economists were struggling over, what does it mean to start a settler colonial territory? And there were very contentious debates. But in all of these debates, I wanted to show how the goal of a capitalist society, or even a socialist society, to think about the Saint-Simonians, were entangled with racial projects, in that they assign differential capacities and values based on innate characteristics that were imagined to come from Islam. And so for many people, this might echo Max Weber's argument about the Protestant work ethic. Right? Famously, Weber argues that the Calvinist view of individual election or salvation encourages hard work and efficiency, which in turn spurred the development of capitalism. Interestingly, Weber contrasted this with Islam. He saw Islam as organized around predetermination rather than predestination. So the accent was less on individual election and more on the fact that all events had been predetermined. And another moment that Weber was helpful for me to think about is that while we tend to think about Protestantism or Islam primarily in terms of religion, that is a theological corpus, a notion of transcendence, Weber actually was very open regarding the fact that religion, in his mind, shaped biological reproduction. And he even writes about the importance of hereditary and biological factors in creating attitudes towards capitalism. So in one of the footnotes, he writes that he hopes that advances in racial neurology and psychology would help confirm his analysis. So again, a kind of warning sign or lesson in how porous these racial and religious categories were, especially in the 19th century, of course. To turn to so I've perhaps demonstrated some of the theoretical apparatus. I was introduced twice as a historian, so now I will make good on the promise that I did archival work, and I do indeed have a historical story to tell. In the history of French Algeria, it's important to notice, unlike Morocco or Tunisia or other territories in the French Empire, first of all, Algeria is an integral part of France, right? 3 departments. It's not legally a colony. But also, attachment to Islam was a juridical category that influenced access to capital, taxes, and land. So nobody is concerned with whether these subjects are practicing Muslims, right? Nobody cares if they're fasting, if they're praying. What matters is what legal regime they're coming under, which then in turn shapes access to property and capital. And I think, and if this interests folks, we can talk about this more, but some of the discussions happening in France right now about why Islamophobia or Islam cannot be a racial category hinges on the fact that you can always convert, right? How can you talk about Islamophobia as racism when all you need to do is tomorrow you convert, you're not Muslim anymore, and ergo this notion of race evaporates because it's about election, right? You can choose something. But what we see in Algeria is even the need to create an entire another legal category of Christian Muslims in order to keep the structures of property and citizenship intact. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. But that's really kind of the backstory to the late colonial period that I'm interested in. I'm also trying to think about Cedric Robertson's work here in terms of the racial character of capitalism, and to think about that in a Mediterranean frame. So much of the theorizing around racial capitalism has been thought about in the Atlantic world on the basis of slavery, skin color, and other more clearly phenotypic arguments. But what happens if we want to think about capital accumulation and the way it intersects with race in a different geographical and also racial formation? So there are kind of 3 moments to the story that I tell in the book, and I want to kind of move on quickly here so that we have time for discussion. The first is the interwar period, when you have the rise of development policies or mise en valeur, which comes about at the same time that readers are celebrating frameworks by people like Albert Camus, right? There's a renaissance of the Mediterranean as a civilizational framework that dovetails with the notion of Eurafrica or the Mediterranean as a development framework. And what I try to show in the early chapters is how both the kind of Mediterranean myths associated with Camus, and you could think about this, Phoenicianism in Lebanon or Pharaonism in Egypt. This is a kind of, I think, region-wide tendency to try to think about the Mediterranean and civilization in a way that excludes Islam and Islamic civilization. And certainly that happens with Camus and some of his kind of literary cousins, some of whom are actually working for the French colonial administration. And it also happens in the domain of the economy. If you think about the standardization of products like wine on the one hand, which is seen as a European crop, and olive oil on the other hand, which is seen as a kind of native or Muslim crop. So the way that the adjective Muslim crop even operates, for me, is fascinating, because it's not just about who's growing it. It's also about the capacity for it to become a commodity and standardized and modernized in circuits of kind of nascent European capitalism, right? Because we're in the early years of European economic integration, where people are thinking that Eurafrica could be the basis for what will become the EEC, or the European Economic Community. And interestingly, some of my technocrats, I'm the only one who finds technocrats interesting often at dinner parties, at least. People have, they're working on bandits, or they're working on these like really interesting people living in the margins, and my primary actors are technocrats. But what I do find interesting about some of them is that they were involved with Monet in European planning, and then they come to Algeria, and then they go back to France. So there's a way in which many of these tools of European integration are also part of a colonial story. The heart of the book is the period after World War II, when the Algerian War begins, and the Constantine plans, the Constantine plan. And here, with 1958, you have the birth of the Fifth Republic, which really brings the full technocratic force of French economic planning to bear in Algeria. And the notion that there is a planification à la française, that there's a French way of economic planning, becomes very widespread and borrows a lot of social scientific tools, notably from the United States. So, behavioral psychology, sociology, these become a way to express a method of planning that's not just about the numbers. It's really an act of social engineering. And so I'm interested in how the economy tries to embark on a project of racial transformation under the guise of this social engineering moment. And one kind of anecdote about this is, during the Algerian Revolution, as de Gaulle is trying to think about his strategy, he says, "An economist will fix this for me." Right. So de Gaulle himself, when he assigned someone to take over the Constantine plan, right, the initiative that's supposed to pacify, quote unquote, the war, he doesn't bring in a colonial official or an Orientalist. He brings in a technocrat who had worked in Brussels with Jean Monnet, right? And this is how he believes the Algerian war will get, quote unquote, fixed. Alongside the military, of course, but the role of people like Paul Delouvrier is very important. Consistent with the French post-war embrace of colorblindness, which a lot of scholars have remarked on, this reticence to talk about race in an explicit fashion, right? You can think about the Constitution of '46, which strikes the word race as a vocabulary. So how do we identify a structural issue if we have no word to identify it? Planners are also trying to avoid any explicit references to race or religion. But at the same time, the assumptions about the inherent aptitudes of Muslims to make money, to understand what a market society would be, to save, to invest, are inbuilt into the plan. So another way to think about this is that the racial hierarchies constructed through colonization are embedded, but also disavowed in writing this development plan and putting it to work. So the question was whether Muslims could participate in so-called industrial civilization. And the plan itself was supposed to be part of a public relations campaign. And planners decided that public relations was a more palatable term than psychological warfare, for example. And in this, the plan would have a mystique or a recognizable brand. So just to give you some idea of how these social scientific apparatus, things like polling, the Gallup poll from the US, are infusing French planning in Algeria, but in a way that makes the central fact of the demographics of Algeria invisible, right? They very rarely come out and say, we're doing this because the people are Algerian Muslims and therefore inferior. They will say, right, there are cultural differences. They'll put it in language that for the Fifth Republic is a little bit more palpable. So I'll just end quickly by talking about how the Constantine Plan and late colonial planning impacts the new Algerian nation state after 1962. And I've skipped over here the ways that the FLN responds to colonial development. A lot of that's in the book. But when Ben Bella comes to power in 1962, and of course this brings the country to the brink of a civil war, he has this notion of a specifically Algerian socialism rooted in Islam. That's the official policy. And it's reflected in things like autogestion, self-management, and his notions of speculation as a criminal offense. So I'm forgetting my own chapters now. The last chapter of the book, the last two chapters look at what does the Constantine Plan and colonial development mean for Algeria after independence. And so that Ben Bella opts for a radical socialist discourse as a break with colonialism is hardly surprising given the geopolitics of the time. But what I think is perhaps more interesting is how this racial regime of religion is fundamental for understanding two things in Algeria. One, why Islam rather than Arabness becomes the center of Algerian identity. And secondly, how the economy becomes an important domain to fashion revolutionary subjects that were the basis of citizenship after 1962. So the June 1962 Tripoli program, which is the earliest official blueprint for Algeria, claims that Islam functioned, quote, as more than a religion. And it also specified that religion would be the main source for Algerian culture and personality. Similarly, the 1963 law invokes Islam as a hereditary principle, once again consolidating Islam as a cultural framework, as well as a question of origin. So it was necessary that the father of an individual that was born in Algeria had fallen under Islamic personal status law during colonization. So in many ways, it refers back to the initial logic of personal status law that had been the focal point for the racial regime of religion that I'm interested in. This chapter, for those who are interested in the Middle East and North Africa, I think brings something new to the table in that I read kind of Algerian works on nationalism alongside Ba'athist propaganda from Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. So notably at AUB, they had had these youth days of support for Algeria. And one can really see quite clearly disputes over what Algerian nationalism is about and a kind of misreading from the Mashreq about Algerian identity as part of a kind of pan-Arab project that was quite different from how people in Algeria were formulating it at the time. So I think that many works that have tried to do this and that have only used the French language sources are kind of missing out on the ways that Pan-Arabism is also negotiated by Algerian nationalists after 1962. The other thing that is fascinating that I think is part of the legacy of this story is how economic activity itself becomes construed in religious terms, even when we're talking about a kind of specific form of Algerian socialism. So the Minister of Agriculture and Agrarian Reform at one point writes, Al-Baraka fil Haraka, right? There is benediction and movement. The Algerian masses, which were previously prisoners of fatalism and superstition, are not only developing a collective will and a force of energy, but an authority that will replace the destructible colonial power. Islam is thus not a hereditary defect, nor an ideological obstacle, but a motor nerve that is necessary for the revolution. So we go from having Islam as a fundamental impediment to market society in a kind of liberal vein to Islam as a necessary motor for socialism in a revolutionary vein. But in both cases, something called Islam is inherently tied to an economic activity. Right, and we can also talk about the ways in which the radical left in France, the so-called Pieds Rouges, and even people like Pablo Michel Ratis come to Algeria to help Ben Bella, and I argue in many cases have a fundamental misreading of the situation. They come with their own revolutionary baggage in some ways, in the sense that they think they know what revolution looks like. And they kind of mourn the fact that for the moment in Algeria, revolution and Islam were tied together, but they were optimistic that at some point Islam would be shed and a real revolution would come to pass. So they had their own kind of anti-clericalism that they brought to the table, even as they're offering, a certain amount of heroic bravery and support to the regime at that time. So, that's kind of the place where the book ends, is on these conflicting visions in France about the meaning of the Algerian Revolution after 1962 among progressives and people on the left. So the Pieds Rouges, or the kind of international Trotskyists, or even people like Daniel Guérin, the anarchists on the one hand, and the coopérants, who are tied to French state projects of development and who come back to try to help the Algerian nation state set itself up. And they're in a more liberal vein of kind of culturalism, of understanding, but they too are unable to see the ways in which colonialism fashioned Islam as a racial category. So I end with these kind of two blind spots on the kind of more left spectrum of things, which I think also tells us something about the tools that the left has currently, certainly in France, to think about revolution and social change, and why it's been so hard for certain people on the left to think about Islamophobia alongside questions of class, for example. Thinking about Algeria, the tropes of Homo economicus and homo, see, I'm not even able to say it. How could this have been a book title? The tropes of Homo economicus and Homo Islamicus also did not disappear in 1962, and the afterword shows how they structured competing imaginaries of development in North Africa and the Middle East after the fall of the colonial state, reading intellectuals like Malik Ben Nabi, who actually has an entire book on this that was not translated into French, and so I think has gone unnoticed. And so I guess in terms of Middle Eastern studies, I hope the work helps us understand how religious divisions structured imperial belonging, but also played a key role in the subsequent construction of nation states, which had to incorporate or suppress religious, ethnic, and or linguistic distinctions in the service of consolidating a national identity. And I think I'll end there. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks, Muriam. Before we go to a Q&A session, I will invite my colleague and the head of our department, Competent Development Studies, Sami, who will be our discussant, give a small reflection, and then kickstart the Q&A session himself with a couple of questions. Sami?
Thank you, Koen, and good evening, everyone. It has become evening already. What is there to add? I would say I've written my short introduction speech more than really a discussion paper this afternoon, and I will, I presume, repeat quite some of the things that Muriam already touched upon in her wonderful presentation. But at least, perhaps it shows that I've read the book, or at least that I understood some of the things that Muriam wanted to communicate to us through the book. First of all, I'm very happy. I'm also thrilled that Muriam was kind enough to come to Ghent, because I have to confess, I have been an avid follower, if perhaps not a fan, of her work for many years. Reading her publications on Algeria on the Jadalia website, her academic papers for several leading academic journals, her always thought-provoking essays for a wider audience, or her insightful comments on Facebook on our shared favorite sports, football. Markets of Civilization was, at least for me, a much anticipated and long-awaited book. Now, the main reason, and Muriam touched upon it, is that her work seemed to me always combining some sort of cultural analysis with the material ways in which capitalism is organized, or to put it in other words, trying to bringing together post-colonial theory and political economy. And Markets of Civilization is no exception to this disciplinary dialogue, which has until now been either a bit of a deaf conversation, or sometimes even a matter of bitter conflict between the protagonists. Instead, Markets of Civilization offers a very rich, at times dense, but always nuanced historical analysis of how racialized understandings of Islam have been fundamental to economic development, or better, underdevelopment in Algeria. Through 6 chapters and an epilogue, Muriam shows how ideas about Islam and Muslims have shaped the political economy of colonial and post-colonial Algeria, which is really important. These ideas on and representations of Islam constituted a technology of differentiation, or as Muriam states, a racial regime of religion, a system of rule in which religion represented a set of origins and imagined bloodlines that structured access to property, citizenship, and livelihood. Islam did not merely justify unequal access to economic value, but rather constituted the very terms in which economic policies were envisaged and implemented. So Markets of Civilization thus offers the reader a much needed academic intervention into the connections between race, capital, and the economy, enabling the reader to deepen his or her understandings of racial capitalism by offering new and innovative insights. I already mentioned the bridging of post-colonial theory with political economy, but the book is equally, if not more important, in broadening the geographical scope of racial capitalism as a concept beyond the Atlantic world, which makes it possible to centralize religion and not skin color as the racial marker, and shows that the history of economic thought in the same time was and is not the purview of a narrow group of European or Western intellectuals. This then in turn enriches the discussion on Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism. As Muriam raises the question in her introduction, what does it mean to use the tools of racial capitalism in a context where religion, not skin color, served as the basis for legal exclusion and economic precarity? So the book shows how the installation of a settler colony in Algeria, even though it was not legally officially a colony, but 3 departments integrated into the l'Hexagone, the mainland France, even though how the installation of the settler colony in Algeria throughout the 19th century established a system of rule in which the religion of Islam was made into an ethnic category, an imagined set of assumptions built around the Orientalist trope of the Homo Islamicus. Through policy, law, control of institutions, Islam was thus racialized. And this racial regime enabled the French to not only deny Muslim Algerians equal citizenship, but also enabled them to think about all economic theories and practices in terms of religious difference. Europeans in the French imagination were individualistic, rational, and able to act in the self-interests of the market, while Muslims, of course, were being described as fatalistic, anti-rational, and ill-disciplined. Although widely debated, Muslims were seen as unable to run a modern economy with in contradistinction to the Europeans. And it is the racialization of these ideas which sets the French practice in Algeria apart. On the basis of religion, Muslims in Algeria were disproportionately subjected to racism. European settlers, by contrast, gradually came to occupy a position of structural whiteness, defined by social, legal, and economic privileges, and immunity to colonial state violence rooted in the personal status law. The distinction between the European Homo economicus and the Homo Islamicus thus had concrete effects on how capitalism was rolled out in Algeria. And interestingly, this racializing did not stop after the Algerian independence, as Muriam just highlighted. She shows convincingly, I think, that after Algeria regained its sovereignty, the inherent fault of Islam being turned around into a necessary, inherent, and positive feature as being conducive to Algerian socialism. And this opens up a myriad of questions on how Algeria's socialism was connected to ideological debates in the wider region on Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. The Algerian war for independence was hugely important for Arab nationalism and Arab nationalists throughout the Maghreb and the Mashriq, while Arabism seemed to be less important in Algeria itself. What did it mean to incorporate Arabism in a country so devastated by more than a century of colonial rule and with a large Amazigh population? In the aftermath of its independence, Algiers was also seen as the capital of third worldism. the Mecca of revolution, as Jeffrey Burns coined it, showing that the Algerian anti-colonial nationalist struggle culminated in a very ambitious agenda to reshape not only its own society, but also international society. However, what I have found fascinating in the book is that Muriam seems to describe post-colonial Algeria more as an intellectual and ideological battlefield. Not only revolutionary ideas in its many forms and guises were heavily discussed and debated, but also liberal ideas, as well as what Muriam calls social Catholic trends and ideas on economic development, what we know in Belgium more as Christian democracy or Christian personalism. Through the book, and especially after World War II, a number of highly influential politicians, technicians, and economic planners seem to be rethinking developmental plans from a social Catholic point of view. And these did not disappear overnight after independence. And as such, Markets of Civilization is for me also a book situated within the field of global intellectual history, a term you haven't used at the beginning of your introduction. Now, of course, the number of book presentations and talks Muriam already gave since the publication of the book is testimony to the fact that is the characteristic of any good book, that it elicits a lot of questions and stimulates debate. So let me, in order to start our discussion, end by formulating just two questions. There's many more that we could discuss, but there's just two ideas that I wanted to put for you. The first question relates to the fact that you warned the reader that Algeria is a specific case of racializing Islam. You point out that French occupation of the country was quite different from how colonial rule evolved in other French territories. Now, I am curious to hear whether the racialization of Islam took different forms in other French colonies. Was it less focused on religion as a marker or not? Was it indeed more skin color that was used, or do you have any idea whether it was some sort of mix? In short, what kind of theory building can we expect starting from the Algerian case? If not all discussions of or uses of religion, and in this case Islam, are necessarily racist or racializing, how do we differentiate between different forms of racialization, and what does that do for critical race studies? And a second question relates to what you have called the reluctance of French scholars to treat Islam as a racial category, and you pointed it out also twice during the lecture, the introduction. Now, indeed, in contemporary France, there is a very pervasive production of an analytical division between race and religion, the former referring allegedly to permanent features such as skin color or biology, while the latter is seen as flexible, changing as a matter of personal choice. Now, while one can trace this division in the French case to very specific political developments in the country, since the French Revolution, and of course was even stressed even more after World War II. It is not so hard to observe the same reluctance to treat Islam as a racial category in most of the other European countries, where religion played quite a different role as compared to France, and who had no or almost no colonial connections to Islam or Muslims. So where do you think this same type of reluctance to treat Islam as a racial category comes from in the non-France setting, I would say? I thank you very much. Okay, if you want.
Thank you so much. We were chatting earlier, and I said it's strange you put a book out in the world and you kind of like passing around the object, but it's a very different experience than to have somebody actually read it and talk back with you and to you. So I really appreciate the generous remarks and the questions as well. And I like the global intellectual history one. I should have put that in the introduction. I think both of the questions that you're asking me are getting at how to deal with the specificities of France and Algeria and their relationship and their own individual trajectories on the one hand, and global, if we could even go that far, kind of global notions of Islamophobia or discrimination that happen around Islam in different contexts. So I'll start with the Algerian case. My hesitancy, there's a lot of work that's done on kind of global Islamophobia, the racialization of Muslims, especially after the War on Terror. And I think that that makes a lot of sense given the development since 9/11, but I'm hesitant to then read that back into the 1950s or into the 19th century. And I'm also hesitant, the word racialization for me, my advisor, as one of my advisors through my many years of graduate school, always said, well, what does it mean? That racialization basically doesn't explain the process, right? That if to say somebody is racialized means that somebody else is non-racialized, as if race was something that either existed or didn't. And so I guess with Algeria, I was interested in the specific mechanisms of power and exclusion that let me think about race and religion together, which is not to say that doesn't exist in other territories, but I think it's much less obvious. So if we wanted to think about the Maghreb, I hope that these tools could be applied to Morocco or Tunisia, but it would probably look quite differently, specifically because citizenship was not premised on renouncing Islam as a religion, right? The Senatus Consultus really, I think, changes the way that Islam shapes access to citizenship, but certainly you could make parallel arguments documenting a similar pattern in Tunisia or Morocco, but I think it would look differently. So in some ways, I think Algeria is a kind of limit case study that makes this very clear, precisely because of that. And so I guess, we might need a different vocabulary to think about how race operates in other colonial territories where you have Muslims. But I think that's the case for all racial formations, that no two racial formations are the same. And so to think about anti-Blackness in the US looks very different than to think about anti-Blackness in Europe, for example. And so my invitation is to be careful about how race operates rather than a kind of blanket statement about the racializations of all Muslims at all times, all places. And so perhaps I err on the more conservative side of that in the book. That was probably a self-protecting mechanism. But of course, I do hope that this gives us some ways to think outside of Algeria. Similarly, with the left in Europe and its reluctance to think about Islamophobia and race, one answer that has been provided is that since 1492, the kind of identity of Europe as a place is built on Christian foundations, and that the Muslim and the Jew were always seen as others. And so what does it mean to be European? And one could think about this with Turkey's attempts to join the EU, for example. To be Christian is to be European. That Christianity and Europeanness are somehow bound. Even thinking about Europe, what do we mean by Europe? Are we talking about countries that belong to a technocratic space? Is this a civilizational space? Are we thinking about Eastern Europe, which often, people kind of think about Europe as Western Europe. So there are all kinds of ways which the term Europe is a construction, and not least of which is the fact that if you saw a map of the EU or the European Economic Community in 1959, it had Algeria on it because Algeria was territorially an integral part of France. So the jokes when Brexit happened was that Algeria was the first Brexit, and everything always starts in Algeria for those of us who love Algeria very much. So I think there is also a question about the way that communism in Europe thought about anti-colonial struggles. It was very difficult for the French left to get behind the FLN. They at first got behind Massali Haj, who was a much more legible figure in socializing among the Algerian working class in France, right? So there's also a question of how the European left understands class formation and their inability to grasp other forms of non-industrial territories when the proletariat cannot be the hero of history because the proletariat has been exported elsewhere. So I guess, the two similarities would be, a history of a communist or socialist left that has had trouble understanding extra-European social formations on the one hand, and a certain notion of Europeanness that often slides into a civilizational category rather than a geographical or even governance unit, if that makes sense. But certainly, part of my kind of intellectual trajectory has been going between these really big questions in theory and these really small questions in history, especially as somebody who works in France quite often, where the discussion on Algeria is treated as it's kind of its own thing. It doesn't often speak to broader questions in social theory. And so, I think one of the risks of writing that kind of a book is that sometimes perhaps I get too big and sometimes I get too small. And perhaps in saying how specific Algeria and France was, I certainly didn't mean to undercut my own relevance and say, nobody else should read this book. I hope other people do read this book, but that's one way of answering it. Thank you for the generous reading.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thanks. If there are any questions from the audience?
I have a more general question. So it was said that Algeria was like the place where a new kind of intellectualism was formed, a new sort of pluralism. So my general question is actually, you have this intellectualism that goes, I think, against this racial capitalism. And racial capitalism, in my understanding, is something that exists for a very long time, and it has always to adapt itself. So my question for you is like, if you have to say 2 or 3 essential points of how this racial capitalism adapted itself after this intellectual movement and after all these people are like coming together to change it, what is like the adapting form of racial capitalism in that way, if you understand.
Yeah, I think I do. So the kind of anti-colonial movement that is trying to push for a more equal world where racial capitalism would be dismantled. So, the work of Frantz Fanon, I think, would loom really large in that question. You have people thinking about, he didn't put it in these terms, but he talks about stretching Marxism, right? That there's something about Marxism, and this might get to the European left question, that didn't quite understand what was happening in colonial territories. And Marx himself goes to Algeria at the end of his life and writes these amazing letters to Engels from Algiers. I recommend people who read French, they're incredible. So on the one hand, you have that awareness that, the FLN in their memos and writings and places like Révolution Africaine that are writing after independence wouldn't use the term racial capitalism, but they understood that there was, they would sometimes call it Ansouria or Irqiya in Arabic, that there was a racial component to French rule. The problem with the kind of intellectual critique is that the global structures of capital are very slow to change. And so even somebody like Ben Bella, I found in the archive, you have Algeria as part of the European Economic Community, clearly a neo-colonial formation, Fanon would tell us, clearly still extracting value and wine, right? They still need to sell all this wine that they have after 1962. And they're still getting preferential trade deals from Europe. So again, clearly neo-colonial, but the Algerian economy is in shambles, right? I mean, wine is kind of all they have. They have oil as well that had been more recently discovered in '56. And so that, the wine and other agricultural exports to Europe are still providing income. And Ben Bella writes to the European Economic Community to ask for that the preferential tariffs continue, right? So even though there's this critique, and Ben Bella is giving, very convincing socialist rhetoric, the notion of being self-sufficient isn't an economic reality at the time. The same way that, behind closed doors, I don't know, I've thought about this scene. I don't know if it ever happened, but I'm sure that Ben Bella and company are like, these coopérants, they're totally living some fantasy. The coopérants are living together. They have, they are progressive in the sense that we're not pro-empire per se, but they were not revolutionaries. But who else is coming, right? Who else is going to teach? Who else is going to be in the hospitals? Most of that class of people left in '62 because they had been European, and it takes Algeria, 15 years to get Algerians teaching at universities, for example. So I guess to answer your question, there's the issue of a critique of what happened during empire and those centuries-long structures, and then how do you actually put a political economy or policy in place that could undo that. And I think that also gets at the complication. Like now when we talk about decolonizing things, we forget that colonialism meant that you couldn't often go to a kind of tabula rasa, right? There wasn't any way of just starting new. And I think in Fanon's writing himself, he goes back and forth, between wanting the totally fresh start and understanding the weight of what happened. So I think part of the work, or one question I'm interested in, is how do you both have this radical demand for decolonization, which Algerian nationalists did, and yet work within the structures that you have, which often are a little bit more compromised. And certainly when decolonization happened, it wasn't as if everybody was enfranchised and prosperous and politically free under Ben Bella, who I talk a lot about his political authoritarianism, or Boumediene. So I guess it's complicated. It's a very long way of saying it's complicated, but thank you for the question.
So,
yeah. Thank you so much. This is so enjoyable, and also the book itself, I highly recommend it. She's completely underselling it.
I've got royalties to cash it on.
Yeah. Actually, so what Morocco did in terms of who's going to be in the hospitals and the schools, Morocco actually brought in Romanians and Bulgarians, which kind of also gets back to the question of who's, are they Eastern Europeans Europeans?
Yeah.
Or are they something else? Really fascinating. But I loved how you brought in the work that the regime, like the kind of racialization of Islam is doing. And again, interesting because I work in Morocco, could Muslims participate in industrial? In Morocco, it was like, could they live in multi-story houses, right? And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And so for me, the question is like, sometimes the concept doesn't actually seem to be doing any kind of work. So what's happening when it's not actually being productive? It must still be doing something, right? Are there any clues to that? Because I couldn't quite figure it out from the text. Does it just sometimes kind of run up against itself and then become useless? And the other question I had, because I also love technocrats, and what happened with some of the other territories like Morocco, a lot of the urban planning technocrats, they did end up exporting a lot of the experiments to other places, and they sort of become this new class. They become like the incipient class of global consultants. So they would go and build refugee camps, in Bangladesh or Pakistan. So this knowledge, this colonial experimentation in North Africa, does get exported. Does that happen with the experiments in Algeria?
Yeah, thank you. This question about Eastern Europeans and North Africa and technocrats, there's an edited volume if we want it in the future, but because when they are bringing on international consultants through the Ford Foundation, I worked in their archives for a little bit, the French are getting really annoyed by Eastern Europeans. They get kind of territorial, right? Like this is our terrain for expertise. Algeria at this moment is getting very close to Yugoslavia. There's an alignment happening there. And so, that is a really interesting story. And there are not many Hungarians, but there are some Hungarians who come in agriculture, for example, in Algeria. But again, it becomes a kind of competition precisely because there's so much attention on Algeria as this testing ground for decolonization. And in terms of what these ideas are doing when they're not, so you're saying when they're not actually producing any economic value.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't have a great answer for that. I think there's also a lot of disagreement about it. So some people would say, Islam can be made productive, but you have to sell it in traditional ways. So one of the images in the book is of a farmer's almanac that has these sayings that are kind of modeled on like Zohar stories or kind of Quranic hadith sometimes. And so the notion is that if you're going to make rational arguments to Muslims for the economy, they'll get it, but it's better if you go through a form they understand, right? So there's a whole realm of answers to the question of can Muslims be can you create economically rational actors out of Muslims? There's a range of answers to that question, but they all come back to this notion that Islam is somehow essential for economic behavior. So to me, that is part of kind of just the intellectual apparatus, even as people are disagreeing, and sometimes these things are very counterproductive. And in housing policies, I did interview one of the people who was responsible for housing, because there's a lot to be said about housing in the Constantine Plan. I do more with agriculture. But he was saying two things. One, that yes, the norms were totally culturally foreign. So, and again, how he understands culture is very interesting. That they were built shoddily, but that at least in Algeria, you could get things done. Whereas in France, you'd have to go through 8 million ministers and get, all of this paper. Yeah, so there's a similar discourse. And so I think that also means that in places in the Maghreb where young people cut their teeth and gained experience and could do all these things they couldn't do in France without waiting 20 years, they ended up being the core of, I did some archival work at the French acronyms were always the SCET, which is one of the financing mechanisms for development that then goes on to have an international consulting firm. And so a lot of them go there. Paul Delevoye comes back to Paris and sets up the Ville Nouvelle, which is part of the expansion of Paris. So so absolutely a colonial story. But I guess in the book, I make the case that I shy away from the laboratory of modernity stuff because I think it's more fluid than that. I don't think they just went to the colonies, got some modern skills, and then came back to the metropole. I think that there was actually kind of a more international diffusion happening that wasn't so one directional, including coming from the US with the social sciences. But yeah, that's Eastern European thing is really interesting.
I just have a question. So I'm also from Algerian, from Algerian origin, and so my father entered in France as how to say, as a Français avec un statut indigène musulman, just like you told. And when the war started, the campaign of the Algerians was they were saying, or the motto was. L'Algérie est musulman et arabe in that time, and it was to make their main focus was to get all the French out. That was their goal. And so they used it against them, in fact, for me. And I also this in the in 1962, there were even more, there were lesser people, Algerians, who could read and write than in 1830, so when the French entered. So the colonialism was really devastating for the Algerians. And that's the reason for me that they went, they didn't want they wanted all the French out of the country, but really all of them. They were going through a corridor, really corridor. My father was even watching them, how they get out on a corridor with goats and their cows. They were taking everything with them because it was too much.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for that, both sharing the anecdote and for reminding us that, again, it was l'Algérie n'est pas française, we're Algerian, we're Arab. And you're right also that, Ben Bella at moments, when he goes to Tunisia and he says, nous sommes des Arabes, nous sommes des Arabes. But at the same time, when Ben Bella goes to Cairo and tries to give a speech in Fusha, he's not able to, and he starts crying because, there's a question also about Arabism as language that is very hard, precisely because of the destruction of the language and culture and the way that language operated. So that as well is part of the story. I mean, similarly, when Nasser and Ben Bella have a very uneasy relationship because of this question of who's going to be the pan-Arab symbol, and then but at the same time, because there were so few people to teach at the university, even as much as the Algerians wanted to kick all the French out. When you look at who's teaching at the Fac d'Alger in 1965, a lot of them are still there, you know, and it's not because ideologically they wanted it, it's because they needed people to teach sociologists and, you know, economists. And so there is this kind of elite. I'm right now working on sociology in Algeria, and it's not until, you know, well, it's not until the late 70s that things Arabize, and it's not until the 70s that you have an Algerian teaching sociology at the Fac d'Alger. So it's just, you know, again, decolonization, unfortunately, was a slower process than many would have liked.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. I also really enjoyed reading the book. But I have one question on the question of Amazigh. So, I mean, knowing a little bit what happened in Morocco, so I had this idea that the French protectorate was also trying to separate like the categories between the Arabs, the Amazigh, and also in terms of linking it to your arguments about the Homo economicus, trying to say that most of the Arabs were also nomads, so they, you know, they were environmentally destructive. They didn't know how they weren't fixed in one space. While the Amazigh were more fellahin, you know. But I wanted to understand a little bit from your research on Algeria how this category also played in the question of racial likeness, and also creating like you know, like differences between and how then this could you know, influence the concept of racial likeness.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I do think there's a way in which by setting the book up as the kind of exclusion, Homo Islamicus, Homo economicus, I stand by that. You know, what obscures, of course, all the internal divisions in Algeria, right? Algerian Jews, Amazigh, right? It's not as if everybody in Algeria is a homogeneous population, and there are differences, or even people in the Mozab who are seen as more, you know, better at commerce. So even though the so-called Kabyle myth that they were somehow less Muslim or only superficially Muslim, or they were more rational than the bad Arabs, that exists. And for example, when people in the metropole, there's a very good chapter on this actually for Belgium and Moroccans coming to Belgium. People are more likely to try to hire Amazigh workers because they think they're better workers. And so that absolutely exists as a kind of mentalité for people. But at the same time, legally, Amazigh also are governed by the same citizenship laws as Algerian Muslims, even though Algerian Jews are not, right? Algerian Jews get citizenship automatically in 1870, whereas Amazigh or Arabs do not. And of course, these hard and fast distinctions are also products of colonial rule, especially with the Amazigh Arab dichotomy. So I would say that even though there are gradations in how this gets used and thought of, at the end of the day, they are put into a similar camp in terms of how laws around property or laws around, you know, financial punishments, for example, or taxes get deployed. But I think you're right to point out that part of my frustration also with the kind of moment I was writing in is that everybody wanted everything to be very nuanced. So it was like this moment of contact and fluidity, and I also was coming out of a kind of settler colonial moment where I said, like, yes, there might have been instances, right? There might have been that Algerian who became a very successful capitalist, for example, right? It wasn't as if this never happened. But if you look at this structurally, this is what a settler colony was, right? It's not the fact that there was one or two Algerians who accumulated capital, or a few neighborhoods where there was social mixity, doesn't obfuscate the structure of settler colonialism. And so I think that's the risk you take with this kind of approach. And I try in the book to do some careful signaling around the fact that, you know, even in terms of racial formations, Algeria was a more complicated place than this, you know, that this kind of polar world would suggest. But thank you for bringing that up.
I see Chris and Laura.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting presentation, and also to Sarah for the interesting remarks after the presentation. I haven't read the book yet, but we do have 14 days now coming up where I might I'm gonna try to go through it. No, I'm really interested in general in the question of the enrollment, the difference into projects of accumulation and rule. And also the other important thing that you bring up in the links to Sami's remarks about the circulation of the technology or diffusion of particular technologies of difference as well. Not only sort of the bureaucratic abstraction and routinization of difference through different things, but also the underlying material practices that give rise to that difference. And actually, as you're speaking, you come back to it in the remarks. One example that I had in my head was sort of post-World War I Detroit. And sort of, in the context of the Great Migration, immigration coming in, and the enrollment, Ford sort of had a whole kind of community, ethnic integration-based sort of community development plan, and how different groups were being enrolled into the process of production. This case that I've wonderfully pointed to, but I've never really had the time to do it. But then it becomes interesting because through the Ford Foundation, those ideas that were sort of pioneered in Detroit get circulated, through the Central Valley of California, for example, to the sort of mobilization of migrant labor, sort of Mexican migrant labor, or Latin American migrant labor there, to India, to a lot of other places in the world. And you hit on that sort of circulation back and forth. And I know it's maybe a big question, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some of this, maybe a couple of things that you think are key to that circulation that's moving back and forth in the in your study.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know as much about Detroit per se after World War I, but some of the people that I'm reading, so François Peru, who is a kind of social Catholic economist known for his writings on poles of development and regional theory, is very much thinking with and through Myrdal and Hirschman. So, Myrdal on racism in the US becomes a touchstone for this entire transnational conversation about regional inequalities. And I have a piece on how kind of American racial liberalism gets taken up by Peru and technocrats in Algeria. But I think it's also interesting because, for example, after the Korean War, one of the actual precedents for IQ testing was combatants after the Korean War and to understand who would be a good soldier or not. And so the Americans do this, and they do it on skin color and very clearly racial groups. And when the French pick up on this, they also want to know who would be a good combatant, but they're not able to use the same categories because the categories wouldn't make sense. And so they have to change, the rubrics to make sense of the colonial situation. So I think that there's a way in which, both in the US and in France and in France's kind of colonial spaces, similar questions are getting raised, but some translation work needs to be done to make sense of it. And for me, at least in the post-World War II moment, where these questions of industrialization and race play out are really in the regional underdevelopments, the regions that are underdeveloped in the US versus France's understanding of itself as an empire. So I'm not able to get into specifics, but certainly things like the Tennessee Valley initiatives, people are looking at that as they're planning in Algeria for what kind of big state-led development projects might look like.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I have a good formulation for this question, but it's basically a question about audiences. So in the department, I'm not sure if I told you, but we organized, so we read your book and we discussed audiences and your position in the US Academy and how one who's not part of that academy and is not privy to its discussions might read your book versus someone who's part of the US Academy. And I wanted to hear from you a little bit about reactions as to your theorization of race that you offer in the book, which I know were not always very generous because I read some of them. And I just want to, and just to tell us here, for us thinking about books or in general, just positioning ourselves in the so many academies where we happen to find jobs, what that means in terms of writing for an audience and crafting particular arguments that may travel. And also because you keep intellectual ties also to French intellectual milieux, right? You're not
you're not the US academic who doesn't leave the US,
I
right?
try not to be, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, a little bit about that. If you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first that I had the privilege of writing this with a tenure track job. So the dissertation looked very different because for the dissertation, my advisor wanted me to write a certain kind of dissertation, and I did that. So yeah, there's also the moment in my kind of career where I felt like I could break some of these codes. I mean, I will say also, I know I'm being recorded here, but I don't think anybody's watching, so that's good. I did shop this to Stanford as a Middle East Studies book, and they agreed to publish it, but they were not very enthusiastic about it. I mean, I didn't feel like they cared about the theory part. And I think it was at that moment I realized that I might have strayed too far from Middle East studies in the US, at least, that this was no longer an area studies book. But I certainly don't feel like this is an American studies book either, in that, I did a lot of archival work, there are Arabic sources. And so for me, that's one question, is the area studies question. Maybe because I'm getting older and more reactionary, I feel more deeply identified with Middle Eastern studies than I did 10 years ago, precisely because I think American scholars tend to not learn languages, and they kind of see the global South with a sometimes very broad brush. So that's certainly one tension. I presented the book in France a couple of months ago, and in the UK, and I think there, in the UK in particular, there were some older Marxists that asked, well, if what you're saying is racial capitalism, what's not racial capitalism, and what do you mean that all capitalism is racial? This is not this is like you've completely broken with Marx, and where's the base in the superstructure? So I had that conversation, and that's one I understand. I can kind of participate in that. The threat is always for me that I will be read as the American who works on race in France or in the UK or in Europe, right? Americans see race everywhere. You're all obsessed with race. So you're taking your American lens and you're bringing it to French Algeria. And the least generous iteration of that would be in France, you're part of this post-colonial assault on knowledge. And you are bringing wokeism into the French Academy. We all lived through that moment as well. How do I position myself in that? Yeah, it is a problem. It is a problem. I think that the people who read the book or who've come to the talks are people who are younger, I noticed, than often. I think there is a generation in France who, not that they want to become an Anglophone academic, but they are seeking tools from the Anglophone Academy. I would love for the book to be translated into French for that reason. I also think that I've done my homework, that I'm not just showing up with a theory that's coming from, I'm not just reading Fanon against Stuart Hall, against Althusser. There is research here. And some people are not going to I take a very clear stance on the whole Islamo-Gauchism debate in the book. I've taken that stance, not in the book, for 10 years. I don't see why I would hide it for the book. And I guess for me, it's just about having the legitimacy to move in these spaces, and to do so with humility, especially like if I'm in North Africa, to be humble about my position and my privilege, but also to say, look, I've done the work, and we can have honest disagreements. That's part of what academia is. But I'd rather that disagreement not be because you're American, ergo this cannot bring us anything. Those people exist. I'm not going to convince them. I think I've done my homework. And that's all I can do. The interdisciplinary question is a hard one, and I think I could only write this book. It took me 10 years. I mean, I defended it in 2015, so it took me 7 years of writing and rewriting, and I think I would have written a very different book had I published it 5 years ago. I think it took me a long time to get the theory up to where I want it to be. But the question of audience, I really don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, you guys tell me. I don't know who's going to read it. Maybe some of you read it. That was really kind. And that's right. Yes. But it is a real question when you are at the interstices of multiple discussions that you're not legible to any of them, right? So this might also be not legible to Middle Eastern studies because Algeria fits awkwardly. It might not be legible to American studies because there's a lot of French and Arabic. There is that threat. I'm at a generous institution that I knew would give me tenure with a book, and so I didn't have to worry about that. But had I been somewhere else, I might have written a more conventional work.
Yeah.
Sorry, this could become a session, like a therapy session, so I should stop talking.
So you're bringing working to the French Academy through France.
Exactly.
Oh, I know. That's
Right.
Outrageous.
Yeah.
I think,
There's one question I can just to build up on Nana's question. Well, my question is, did you present your book in Algeria? And if yes, then what was the debate? Because, like, I can understand that in French, like, they would say you bring in the American, like, you know, concept of race to understand Algeria, or to understand like different social influence of colonialism into the impact of colonialism on Algerian communities. But then in Algeria, then how do they would react or would receive to the fact that you're using some of the categories like American notion of race to understand social dynamics that are proper in Algerian communities?
Yeah, I mean, I have two answers. One is that it's funny to me because people like Sint-Pietersnieuwstraat, so not a particularly this is not a very French establishment on the left, but not, certainly not like a firebrand, write books on racism in France. And so it's open, like the ways that in France now you can talk about anti-Arab racism after in the kind of 50s and 60s in the Travailleurs Arabes movement. But then the discussion when you talk about, well, how does Islam factor into that discussion on racism? Then things get really tricky, right? So in some ways, the question of racism, people are starting to have it in France, but they do it on certain terms. I think in Algeria, well, first of all, I haven't gone back to Algeria. I haven't gotten a visa to go to Algeria since 2014. I've tried every year. Yeah, if anybody here can help. So, I've certainly talked to Algerian colleagues in North Africa and in France, and I think that they're much more open to these notions. I think that they're also there's a way when you don't come from the French Academy that a discussion is possible with certain colleagues. But I think actually what will be harder is the Ben Bella chapter. Right, I think that the conversation about Algerian nationalism would be harder, precisely because of the fissures after the Civil War and the kind of ways that people want to read the Civil War back into the 1960s. That Ben Bella was the first anti-gayist, or things like this. I think that will be a hard conversation, but not for the reasons of racism and France. But I hope to have that problem. I mean, I did a short interview in Arabic on the book, but I'm not sure how much, I don't necessarily think it's an Arabic-French question either, but I would love to find out.
Any other questions?
Can you tell us a little bit about your new project?
Sure. Yeah. Project is like a generous word for it. It's kind of a couple of thoughts I've been trying to put together. So I'm interested in how the discipline of sociology tries to decolonize itself in Algeria. As some of you might know, in 1974, the Algerian Minister of Education bans ethnology and anthropology and sees sociology as the third worldist discipline. At the same time, you have figures like Bourdieu and others who are training Algerian sociologists. And so I'm interested in kind of the social sciences and decolonization from the 60s up until the 90s. I'm also starting to think more about Algeria and Pakistan together, and kind of both circulation of knowledge, but also similar questions about language, about partition, about nation state building and Islam. I'm not sure if those two projects are coming together. Right now, I'm working on an article on Algerian readings of Frantz Fanon after 1962 that I hope to have out soonish. I wrote a piece that came out of it in the LARB that was a little bit polemical. That was just a kind of op-ed piece, but I'm actually trying to do the intellectual history of Algerian intellectuals writing on Fanon, because they've been totally erased from the discussion. It's as if Fanon existed in a vacuum. Nobody in Algeria had anything to say about Fanon. It was just like the Black Panthers and company. So that's what I'm working on like this in the next couple of months.
Any other question? I might have one.
Yeah,
question.
please.
No, in the book you make you explain how this distinction is created between Homo Islamicus and Homo economicus. And I was wondering about its afterlife nowadays in France. So, I mean, and they don't use those words anymore, but how because you're also following political discussions in France, and how would it be reproduced or reinvented or somehow, it doesn't have an afterlife in France discussions, and how would you explain it then? Also, maybe in relation to this whole discussion about integration.
Yeah, I think it would be less about economic practice and more markers of culture or belonging or language. So, I think in the 1950s and 60s, the question of economic orthodoxy was actually a civilizational one, because you're in the middle of the Cold War, where the question of liberal market economy or socialism is also about, are you part of the free world or the quote unquote unfree world? And so that takes on different forms. In the US, for example, in the 90s, everybody was obsessed with whether Muslims could be Democrats. It was like this ongoing debate. You had like democracies without Democrats and Muslims without democracies. I don't know, it was like a never ending debate. And there, clearly, it was a civilizational argument about the capacity for democracy. And I think today it would be the capacity for something like tolerance or multiculturalism, although France wouldn't use, vivre ensemble would be kind of a key word. But certainly, also given the way that Muslims making a lot of money have come to stand in for a kind of Orientalist trope of the sheikh. I don't think it would be on the same terms as it was in the 1950s, precisely because these shifts are tied to the global economy and to the way power is operating. That's the best I could do for a Homo Islamicus, Homo economicus answer in 2022. You might have like a Homo petrol super economicus or something like that.
Is there any?
Yes, thank you, Muriam, for this wonderful book. I didn't read the book yet, but I have to do this very soon. I have just a general question, very, very general, about how the discourse on sexuality played a role on the process that you have been researching.
Thank you. So certainly part of the discussion around excluding Muslims from citizenship was precisely because of polygamy. And Judith Circus has a book that really focuses on gender. And the notion of correct economic action and family structures and gender relations are all tied up, and certainly Homo economicus has to be Homo economicus. So I try to show the way that these images are gendered throughout the book, because gender and race are so entangled, and so the kind of effeminate Arab also plays a role in part of these imaginaries. But the book is certainly heavier on the race side than on the gender side. But there's a moment, for example, in the 50s when they're trying to show how Algerian women could be properly domestic, and that has to do with them going to the market, with them not just being self-sufficient at home. So the kind of domesticating of Algerian women to be proper, to act like European women is definitely part of the story. And I didn't go so far with this analysis in the post-62 chapter, but the socialism of the Algerian state is a very masculine, it's a rujula, it's about masculinity in the face of colonial emasculation. But I don't deal with that as much. But certainly, gender is central to the way the proper functioning of the economy should be playing out.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could also speak to how the racialization processes and dynamics that you discussed speak to contemporary foreign policy discussions in Algeria. I personally work on Mali, and I also always see these tensions going on in the debates in Algeria.
Yeah. This was the hardest part of the book for me to write. So in chapter 5, I deal with Algeria's kind of doubling down on Islam as an identity, and I show why Pan-Arabism, or I argue that Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism were both hard fits, even though, of course, Algeria is being Pan-African, etc., and Pan-Arab, but they're awkward. And I argue that they're awkward because of the French colonial racial formation. So on the one hand, the partition between white and Black Africa, of course, they want to disavow that, but there are moments at which even the Algerian revolutionaries seem to suggest that they are not part of Black Africa, or that Black Africa will have a harder time with socialism or development than they were. And so certainly, it's hard. I think one of the complicated things about talking about race in the present is that the structures of power and the reasons for certain racialization have changed. So we could talk about the refugee crisis, right? We could talk about sub-Saharan migrants showing up in North Africa. There are also, I think, some very bad arguments about slavery, right, that we know about, how that has gotten used out. So what I'm hesitant about is taking all of that and talking about anti-Blackness in North Africa, because I think we have to be really careful about the moment and the way that's getting projected. In the 1960s, there is certainly a notion that among some, and I wouldn't want to oversell this, that Black Africa will have a harder time being part of a modern economy. Then, that changes as the geopolitics of the continent and the Arab Union changes, right? And right now, I think Algeria and Morocco are both vying to be kind of an African power for different reasons. But I do think it's important not to just say 1962 happens and all of these colonial legacies go away, but I'm also trying to be careful with how I frame that, precisely because of some of the really bad arguments around anti-Blackness.
One final question. I might have a final question. No, it's with regard to something you write in your book also, that your case could also be served to understand the colonial roots of neoliberal thought. And of course, you refer to the French intellectual from the Mount Society. But I was wondering, I kind of understood, and I was fascinated by your description of the Constantine plan as an example, maybe of colonial Keynesianism or colonial developmentalism. So I was wondering, how could you elaborate then on this colonial roots of neoliberal thought more specifically, because referring to the Mount Pelerin and maybe to earlier ideologues, that also emerged as an intellectual critique on liberalism, but also as an adversary, intellectual adversary to Keynesianism. So how could you elaborate?
It's another excellent set of questions. So I think one of the most jarring things about that argument is that perhaps this is more of an American perspective, but people think that they see neoliberalism, 1980s, Reagan, Thatcher. And in recent decades, there's been this argument that actually the intellectual roots of neoliberalism are in the interwar period after the global economic crash of 1929, and people trying to come to terms with a kind of third way that's not total laissez-faire liberalism, but of course isn't the totalitarianism of the East, right? And that there's this kind of moment at which the civilizational stakes of that become really clear. The American liberals kind of going hog wild on the one hand, and the kind of lack of freedom coming from the communist threat on the other. And that work does look to the social democrats and social Catholics as a really important inspiration for neoliberalism. So Quinn Slobodian's work, James Chappell's work, there's Jessica White, Moral of the Market, or I'm forgetting the name of that book. So there has been this discussion about, what do we do with the 1930s? Foucault himself writes about neoliberalism in terms of this moment. And so I think a lot of that discussion has been obsessed with the East and the West, capitalism and communism, but totally forgets that another major source of quote unquote unfreedom that people are worried about is decolonization. And so it's not just about anti-communism, it's also about how to save empire and with it European civilization. So that's one way, that's kind of the big strokes argument about how and why empire is playing a role in the 1930s going on to the 1950s. The other argument is that the actors I'm studying, people like Paul Delouvrier, are at the very core of European integration, and in other works in French economic history have been slated as kind of early French neoliberals. And so to me, it's amazing that none of that work looks at what's happening in Algeria, where many of these planners were after working with Monet. And certainly the Fifth Republic itself is all about using the state to control the market, or for competition, using the state as a vector for competition to be properly exercised. And that is a different, articulation of neoliberalism than in the 80s, where it's just like, let's try to do away with the state or really minimize the state. And so, there too, just because people are using the same word, they don't necessarily mean the same thing. But I do think that the ways that this gets played out in the colonial territories, the state can do more because of decolonization. It has more resources, particularly during the Algerian War. And it's faced with this civilizational question or racial question of what to do with non-Europeans that, I'm thinking about Jessica, what's her first name? The last name is Lyons, which looks at how colonial officials went back to the metropole and dealt with North African immigrants. And they brought these colonial ways of thinking back with them. So, in thinking about neoliberalism, it's also a question, there was also a racial question being posed that has gotten obscured because of the focus of, East versus West, not looking south. And also because intellectual historians have been pretty bad at dealing with the non-West as a category or as a geographical majority of the globe, right? They like Europe a lot. They like going to those archives. I won't get into that, but yeah, I think intellectual historians of that period have been trained in a certain way that preclude dealing with empire seriously.
If you're
Yeah, sure. Yeah. My jet lag, I'm finally waking up. For me, it's like, yeah.
I'm sure that's a short one. I just wonder if the people you studied, either the European technocrats or the early Algerian decision makers, were there in any way influenced by the real studies of the time, especially the writings on inspired by modernization theory, like Daniel Lerner, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Because what you said, the transition from Homo economicus to Islamicus to economicus, it really mirrors that kind of discourse very, very strikingly.
Yeah, I do think modernization theory is at the back of their minds, but they're also very insistent to put this in French terms. And I think they see that as a kind of Anglo-Saxon way to look at it. But certainly modernization theory is, right, that things are going to progress in stages, right, the takeoff stage, etc. I think that stuff comes more in through the pacification people, through the army, than it does through the French technocrats, who tend to be trained at, Sciences Po, and have a different kind of intellectual genealogy slightly. The army, I think, of the pacification, the Fifth Bureau, are probably more reading modernization theory in English, is my guess. But it's certainly there, right? The presuppositions are there. I didn't see it cited a lot, which is interesting. Yeah, please.
Something, but maybe, I don't know, there's a discrepancy perhaps between the American modernization theory applied to the Middle East, where Islam hardly exists at all.
Yeah.
It's already dead.
Yeah.
It's gone. And I suppose for French officials, for the reasons you explained, that can't be the case.
Right.
Because it's so central to, I don't know.
Yeah, and I do think that they're wary of adopting kind of Anglo-Saxon techniques of planning wholesale, even though they do for some things, and they're certainly reading some things. But yeah, I think the weight of kind of French Orientalist tradition has its own logic, and sometimes gets conjugated with other things, but also is quite insular, right? So they're reading like Maxime Rodinson, they're reading Jacques Berck, they're reading the French Orientalists of the time, more so than the Anglophone modernization theory.
Okay. Then there are no more questions. I want to thank
Thank you all for the great questions.
Okay.